Hope you can see. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, and just let me know if you have any questions for clarification, and then we'll have time at the end for discussion. My plan today is to start from a recent debate in the field of artificial intelligence that is a sort of crisis in the reproducibility, and I will explain later what is meant. But I think this is an interesting starting point to enlarge a little bit from artificial intelligence to computer science, and to discuss this sort of supposed crisis in the reproducibility or reproducibility. Later, again, I will try to clarify. But I think that this idea of replicability is just one part of a larger debate on experimentation. And my main point here in this presentation will be that we need to make attention to the ways in which experiments are made in the field of engineering disciplines or in the artificial sciences, and to enlarge a bit the traditional idea of controlled experiment. So this is the reason why, in the end, I will propose the idea of explorative experiments. And then I will discuss some open issues. Okay, so let's start with this recent debate. And this starts, there's a quite large literature on this. This, for example, is a paper on science, and the idea of this reproducibility crisis is discussed. And here you can see the idea is that because when you deal with artificial intelligence, you have code, then people think that reproducibility is kind of guaranteed. And here this author says that this is not true, because there is a number of reasons why computer scientists and people working in artificial intelligence don't share their source code. And the reasons are like perhaps it's a work in progress, or it's just that the code is owned by a company. This is very common today in artificial intelligence. That is becoming in industry kind of research, or let's say the code is lost, or it is dependent on other unpublished code. So these are, let's say, pragmatic reasons why researchers do not share the code. But here it is interesting also to consider, is it to share the code just the solution to achieve this so-called reproducibility? Because it's true that it's not just a problem of code in particular in artificial intelligence, but in computer science in general, because it's sometimes also a problem of training data, a problem of test beds, a problem of experimental runs. So these are all the elements that are important also to make the full experiment reproducible. And it's true that also many of these information is given for granted in a sense. It's plenty of undocumented assumptions and decisions, and a lot of this information does not go into any paper or into a publication. So this is really a key point. I will go back to this later. It's a sort of gap between what is done in practice and what is documented in the publication. And so here the problem is, okay, researchers should try to standardize experiments to make them more reproducible. Like, for example, here just cases and examples of ways of making this process more standard, like you have repositories, hosting algorithms, and other tools. And here in this context, you can see that different initiatives are promoted. Here, just an example, this is a journal in computer science that is exclusively devoted to redo experiments, to reproduce experiments. And this is kind of strange, and it's the first publication because usually there's no anything similar in computer science. Other initiatives are like famous conferences like in artificial intelligence, like NeoRIPS. They are started to ask authors to share the source code related to their papers. But still, many researchers lament that this is not enough, that these initiatives are just not fully aligned with reproducibility, and that the community should work more in the direction of reproducibility. And usually two main problems are discussed. The first one is time, and the idea that, of course, you need time to test algorithms under different conditions. And of course, time is a problem in general in research. And the second problem is that besides the example of the journal Rescience I was mentioning, it's true that basically most of the publications, no failed replication is reported. And this is, I have done a research, a systematic research on this, and I have found, at least in autonomous robotics, just let's say very few examples of failed replication. Here, just to mention these two papers, just to give you the idea of how this is discussed in the community of artificial intelligence. And I'm a little bit critical, as I will show later with this discussion, because here these two papers try to, let's say, present the state of the art of reproducibility in artificial intelligence, and they analyze more than 400 papers, and they use different metrics with the hypothesis. The main hypothesis is, okay, artificial intelligence research is not good enough to reproduce the reported results, and the finding is, it's true. This is the hypothesis is confirmed because none of the papers reported or documented in an extensive way all the variables. And here in these papers, they start from this idea. The idea is that reproducibility is important. Reproducibility is a way of making artificial intelligence a real science, is a way to align artificial intelligence with the, let's say, traditional sciences. But here the point is that reproducibility is strictly connected to documentation. Now let me better explain this point. I will skip this part just to give you that they try to elaborate a little bit on different types of reproducibility. So they make a distinction between experiment reproducible, data reproducible, and method reproducible. I think this is interesting, but in a sense, it doesn't make full sense of the discussion, and I will explain later why. But it's interesting that in the end, after all this analysis, after the attempt to try to make distinctions between different types of reproducibility, the point is that the recommendations are basically mostly devoted to improve the process of documentation. And of course, this is interesting, but I guess this is just a very small point of the whole discussion. And it's a small point because basically the reason why these authors say that reproducibility is important are the following. Like, you can receive credits for all your research products. You can increase the number of your citations. You can improve the chances to be funded. You can address new journal requirements. So, of course, we have to recognize that these elements are important, but I think that this is just a very minor part of the discussion. And so I think it's not enough just to stay on these pragmatic reasons and discuss this is huge topic starting from these sort of benefits. So in my opinion, there is a number of issues when the debate is shaped in this way. And I guess that probably the most important one is that the importance of reproducibility is given for granted. It's incredible that basically just few papers, and just I will mention just one important paper on this, but just the most of these papers give reproducibility as granted as an important achievement to be achieved in research. Second point is that reproducibility is not analyzed from any critical point of view. And for example, most of the times, reproducibility, replicability, they are used in the same way. There's no any kind of discussion on the meaning of these concepts. The other problem is that reproducibility is only attached to documentation. And then and I think this is the most important point, the specificity of reproducibility for artificial intelligence is not investigated, okay? And then also the problem of the practical benefits. So let me start now to try to see whether we can critically analyze a little bit more the idea of reproducibility, starting from some literature in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is one of the few papers discussing, I would say from a critical point of view, the difference between, for example, replicability and reproducibility. And basically, the argument is like that. They say what scholars call reproducibility is mere replicability. That means that basically it's a version of reproducibility in which researchers want to exactly replicate the experiment, starting from the same experimental setup, the same experimental procedures, and so on. But the author argues that this is just a policing tool. It's not, I would say, a method of a methodological matter, because this tool serves to prevent like frauds in science. But the author argues that the differences in experiments are important. So the reason why reproducibility rather than replicability is important is because with the reproducibility, you have that it's the idea that has been reproduced rather than the same experimental setup. And here the idea that the greater the difference is, the greater information, the greater element to analyze an experimental process is the key point. But it's surprising that papers like this author is also, let's say, an important researcher in particular in pattern recognition and machine learning. It's incredible how these papers are basically not much considered in the discussion. And it's incredible also because in artificial intelligence, there's I would say a milestone book that has been published in 1995 on its empirical methods for artificial intelligence that discusses a lot about experiments and reproducibility. And basically, this is completely forgotten today. And it's incredible because here there's a number of lessons that could be reconsidered in this debate. Like, for example, the discussion on a hypothesis or the analysis of the factors that impact on the variation of phenomena. So, and this is idea of considering some of the peculiarities of artificial intelligence, at least from a methodological point of view, to reconsider this debate on reproducibility or replicability, is again something that has been discussed a bit, I would say 20 years ago. Like, for example, this famous paper discussing, it's one of the papers putting the foundations of artificial intelligence and multi-agent systems. And this is a paper in which this idea that artificial intelligence has some peculiarities that should be taken into account in this discussion is put forward. But at the same time, you can read this quote, and this quote says, it's very important to achieve reproducibility because we can have sort of progress or scientific progress. Otherwise, if we are not dealing with reproducible results, there is just an illusion of progress. And the same kind of narrative we'll see is common to also some papers in computer science, and in particular in the field that is known as empirical computer science. So, and here just to give you again another example, here you can see the science of artificial intelligence. So the use of this idea of the scientific nature of artificial intelligence as an important endeavor, as something that can be proved, can be made stronger if the same methods of science are adopted. So let me now move from artificial intelligence to computer science. And here again, you can find this paper on the communication of the ACM. Communication of the ACM, just to give you that idea that this is not just a discussion in a technical discussion in very technical journals, but the communication of the ACM is like the magazine that discusses general problem in the community. And again, here you can see the replication crisis in empirical computer science. And I guess it's very interesting that it goes back to what Peter Deming, one of the, let's say, founders of this empirical computer science, emphasized back in the 1980s. So if computer science wants to be a real science, wants to move from what is called a hacking science to a real science in the sense of like other sciences like physics, biology, we need to adopt the same standards of science. And if we don't adopt the same standards of science, no one will take us seriously. And this is back in the 1980s. But it's surprisingly, in a sense, that nothing has changed, or just few has changed from this paper, because just to give you an example, here is an attempt, again, coming from ACM, so the largest association for computing professionals in the world. And again, the idea is to try to solve this problem from a purely practical point of view. And this is the idea of the badges. I don't know if you are familiar with these badges, but it's the idea that you have like different badges with different definitions like repeatable, replicable, and reproducible. And you have many conferences asking you to label your papers when you submit them and when they are accepted with these badges, just to have like a standard view to indicate the level of reproducibility of your publication. And then this is also, I think it's important in a sense because it's also a way of changing the practice, because it's a way to try to standardize and to say, okay, if you're labeling your paper with this badge, then you have to provide the source code, then you have to provide other information that then later can make your paper. And because conferences are very important, sometimes in some fields of computer science, more important than journal papers, this is, in a sense, it's a top-down approach to try to change a little bit the practice of the community. But it's interesting that this replication crisis, again, is in general in computer science is very similar to what is discussed in artificial intelligence, and some common issues are identified, and in particular in the paper I was mentioning on the communication of the ACM, like you have the problem of the publication bias, like papers supporting their hypotheses are usually likely to be accepted for publication rather than other types of paper. And you have a number of problems that has been discussed in this literature. But again, what's the problem here? What's the suggestion to try to solve this sort of crisis? Again, the suggestion is to have very practical tools, like, for example, to publish registered reports, like this idea of the pre-registration is that when you submit your paper, you say, you declare what is the hypothesis, what you are going to prove, and then so you cannot change later the setting of the result, the hypothesis and the results. Then, of course, openness at the very different levels is encouraged. And also, this is also very important and much debated, to educate reviewers to behave in a different way, and also to educate authors, like to focus more on questions, on methods, rather than traditional criteria of evidence. But here again, I see some of the old issues that I was presenting at the beginning, but also new issues. And of course, there's a need of a cultural change in a sense. It's true, it's important. But again, there's no any discussion about the specificity of computer science as a discipline to try to include this discussion in this debate on reproducibility of computer science. And again, same old problem, the importance of reproducibility is given for granted. So this is a paper, and this is coming from philosophy of science, and I think it's useful, even if this paper discusses in particular some problems of replicability, starting from psychology and then in biology. But I think this paper can be used for the present discussion in computer science and artificial intelligence. And I think it's interesting because here the discussion is that we don't need to give for granted this importance of replicability. And it's not just a matter of empirical data that are not collected or not collected enough, but it's a problem also of the epistemological standard of replicability and its role in different scientific fields. So this paper suggested that there is what is called a new localism. So the idea that replicability is not a universal standard, but it's a local standard. It depends on from fields to field, and that these specific and local elements of different disciplines are important and should be taken into account. So the first element of this new localism is the nature of the object of interest. So, and in the case of computer science, the nature is not even very clear. What is the nature that you are considering and you want to reproduce? Is the source code, it's the algorithm, it's the program, what is it? So this is, I guess, a key element in this debate. And it's also true that the traditional idea of replicability is not applicable to any field and some areas of research. And here, the debate is usually at this level based on two ideas, like the importance of the context sensitivity, but also the way in which scientific disciplines have been developed. But I will partly use these ideas, but I will move on a little bit, because I think that, and my claim is that replicability cannot be applied as such in the field of computer science and computer engineering. So, but let me now move from replicability to experimentation, because my point here is that replicability is one of the principles of experimentation, and I will use a definition of experiment that I will propose just in a minute, because I think that to a large review on this issue is very important. It's not just a matter of considering replicability as a standard of documentation, as a standard of, let's say, making this field of the scientific field more trustable or more or well documented. It's really a matter of considering the nature of field and the peculiarities of this field. And this is true because, as we will see, this is also very common in the debate, like, again, to say that computer science should adopt the same methods of natural sciences, for example, is very much emphasized. Like, this is an example. I think the title is already very clear. Should computer scientists experiment more? And the answer is yes. And the only way to, this is the only way for computer science to leave adolescence behind and to move to a full mature science in this strong sense. And then here you can also read something that is very common in computer science, and it's the idea that computer science is at risk of considering just as an auxiliary discipline. It means that it's just a tool for other sciences, but it's not a science in itself. And here this author is very worried about this, and so the solution, or a possible solution, is to use more experiments and adopt the experimental methods. But what does it mean to apply the same standards if there is no any discussion on the nature or the very nature of computer science? And this is the definition of experiment I will use, of traditional definition of control experiment I will use today. So an experiment, or better, a control experiment, is a procedure in which some object of study is subjected to interventions, so to manipulations that aim at obtaining a predictable outcome, or at least predictable aspects of the outcome. So predictability of the outcome, usually expressed as repeatability of the experiment, is an essential component of the definition. Experiments provide us with information about regularities, and without predictability or repeatability, we do not have evidence of anything regular. And I think that there are cases, as I will show later, in which we can find instances of this idea of control experiment in computer sciences, but there are many other cases in which this notion does not apply. And let me further articulate this idea considering a very nice book. This book discusses the so-called science of computing, so the attempt of computer science to become a science from a very interesting historical perspective. But it's very interesting for us that he reconstructs at least 5 different ways of using the term experiments in the history of computer science. So this is a book that does not want to say, okay, this should be the way in which computer scientists should use the term experiment, but just says, I want to look at how authors in computing have used the term, not how the terms should be used. And here I will move very quickly, then perhaps later on in the discussion we can go back, because there are at least 5 different ideas, 5 different notions of experimentation. The first one is what is called demonstration of feasibility. So it is just you show that an experimental solution works. So experiments here is not used with any technical meaning, but it's just a synonymous of untested, novel innovation. And these examples are taken from autonomous robotics. A second notion of experiment that is used in the history of computing is try and run. So here the idea is that experiments are studies that aim at finding how well a prototype or a complete system works, like for example, how fast, how much memory is used, and so on. So here experiments is a sort of synonymous of trial run, of trial or test. Then there is a third mention, that is field experiment. And this is important, in particular in autonomous robotics. That is the idea that you want to test how well your robot works outside the lab, so in the field. And here you test the system in a live environment, and you want to measure some of these features. Then you have comparative experiments. Like you want to experiment, you want to evaluate competing solutions. And for example, you test different solutions with the same data sets or same parameters. And then also you have control experiments in the sense they have just defined. And here basically the core feature is to have experiments that allow generalization and predictions. But these are really, I would say, less common than the other types of experiments. So I think that this book is important because if we accept that in the history of computer science, there are different notions of experiments that are used, in a sense, we have to recognize that the practice of experimentation is really much nuanced than what is described in the theoretical debate. And I think that this is my claim and my general question. So if we recognize these differences, does it make sense to apply the same methods of the natural sciences to the artificial sciences? So is it not true to say that, for example, we should try to see whether the artificial real, and I will clarify what I mean by artificial, needs perhaps partly different methods from an experimental point of view. And let me mention a very well-known and milestone paper. This is the paper that Newell and Simon published in 1976 after the AUC during the war. And I think it's very interesting because this is one of the first attempts in computer science to emphasize that experiments in computer science have a very special nature. I don't fully agree with this idea, but I think it's interesting to take into account because then, of course, Herbert Simon proposed the idea of the sciences of the artificial. So it was an idea to try to differentiate, for example, computer science from the traditional natural sciences. And here, for example, he says, or they say, but computer science is very special. So in the case of experiments, you do not need to repeat experiments because each new machine that is built is an experiment, and we need sometimes just one instance of these machines, and we can open up this machine, look inside, and collect information about how it works, and so on. So I don't want to discuss whether we can, I think there are many limitations to this approach in a sense, and in particular today. But what I think is very interesting that already back in 1976, there was the idea to look at computer science as a very special type of science and to emphasize this artificial element that is typical of computer science. And it's nice that, for example, one of the few papers discussing from a philosophical point of view, but written by a computer scientist, discusses this idea, recognizes that engineering is not science, of course, but then has some, let's say, methodological peculiarities. So in a sense, this paper recognizes that computer science has a different ontology from, for example, natural sciences, but at the same time, in a second paper, it says, but anyway, we can adapt from a methodological point of view the same methods of the other sciences, and for example, the proposal is to adopt some traditional frameworks already established in the philosophy of science. So this is really my key point, and then I will try to move to the conclusion. And my key point is that we need to stretch these traditional concepts. So it's not enough just to adapt them and to say, okay, even if engineering is partly different from science, then we can adopt the same method of science. I do think that the traditional notion of experiments in particular needs to be stretched. And stretched means, I don't want to change completely, but I want to revise it along maybe 3 lines that I will clarify. Because I do think that adapting the traditional methods of science is not enough, okay? Because the engineering disciplines have some peculiarities, and we need to take into account these peculiarities. Basically, the peculiarities are, there are many peculiarities, but today I will focus on just 3 of them. So the first peculiarity is the goal for which experiments are conducted. So, and I'm not arguing that this is the only goal for which experiments are conducted in computer science. I'm just arguing that there's also this goal, and we need to recognize that this is important. So experiments are also carried out in computer science, not just to test theories, and it's not even clear sometimes what a theory is, in particular in computer engineering, but to test technical artifacts. And I will say something later on this. It's also the second element that sometimes designers and experimenters coincide, and this is also important, and I will explain why, and that there is a different notion of control that is at work. And if you remember the definition of control experiment I was providing, the very idea of control is a key element in the definition of experiment. So I do believe that we need to take this idea of control seriously, but we need to revise it in the case of the engineering disciplines. So this is the first point, the nature of the object that is the object of experimentation. Here, the object is a technical artifact. And it's a technical artifact means that basically experiments are carried out also to check whether these artifacts meet the desired specifications, the constraints, and so they meet the specifications for which these technical artifacts have been designed and built. So this is an important point. Second point, and this is an issue of control. It's very common that in computer engineering, experiments and designers are the same people. And this is, I mean, strange with respect to the traditional idea of experimental, of the independence of the researcher from what is experimented. This is a case in which it's very clear, sorry. it's very clear that the experimenter is the same as the designer. So I don't want to make any normative claim, but it's true that the traditional independence of the experimenter is different, or is different from what has been discussed so far. This is a nice paper on the crisis of the traditional experimental independence of the experiment. And so here, the idea of limited control, I didn't have time to discuss. Perhaps we can discuss we can consider a bit more on this in the discussion. But this idea of control, I think, is a key element of limited control, in a sense, is a key element when we consider these technical artifacts, in particular in the case of artificial intelligence, where we have like a limited control due to a sort of epistemic uncertainty related to these artifacts. The first reason is that they are complex, very complex. And the second reason is they interact in a complex way with their environment. That means it's not just the external world, but also humans that are in this external world. And so this is the reason why I really like this label of experimental technologies in the case of artificial intelligence, in particular technologies, that stresses the idea that we do not have a sort of complete knowledge to assess the risk and benefits of these technologies. So this has an impact, not just only at epistemological level, but also, for example, at the ethical and policy level. And so this is the reason why I think that we can propose a partly different idea of experiments. Again, I want to stress the idea that I don't want to substitute all the idea of experimentations in computer science. I want to add this further idea because I think it's important to consider and to stretch the traditional idea. So I will skip this part. This is a part in which I try to show why this idea of explorative experiment can be put together with this idea of directly action-guided experiments that Sven Hove Hansson recently proposed. I think this is a very important part because it shows that this sort of pre-scientific notion of experimentation, and this book and some papers are very interesting because Hansson recognizes also from an historical point of view how these technological forms of experimentation were very common, for example, in Syria in the 13th and 14th century, and how they, let's say, emerged before the sort of scientific revolution. But I don't have time to discuss this part. Just to tell you that this it's very important to recognize that these technological forms of experimentations are not completely new. Okay, and just to give you some key elements of this idea of explorative experimentations. And I stress the idea that it's explorative and not exploratory, because exploratory is a label used, for example, in the philosophy of biology. So the first element that is important in this case is that these experiments test technical artifacts, and these technical artifacts have a technical function, a use plan. And the reason why these experiments are performed, is to see whether the artifacts meet these specifications, that express the desired behavior and the reason why an artifact has been designed. The second element is the notion of control. Again, I don't have much time, but then we can consider later on this idea of control. So I'm not saying that these experiments are experiments without control. There is a huge literature claiming that it's possible to have experiments without any control. I think control should remain a key element in the definition of experiments. but I'm claiming that here a different idea of control is at play, okay? And I have introduced this idea of a posteriori control to say that this control cannot be already anticipated at the beginning of the experimental process, but sometimes emerges later. And the third element is that the distinction between experimenters and designers is blurred, okay, and is sometimes not so clear-cut as in other cases. And this is just an example, but I will skip this example coming from autonomous robotics. So let me just conclude with some open issues. And of course, it's plenty of open issues, but I will focus on some of them. The first is, okay, many people say, okay, but you are just proposing this idea of explorative experiments, but they are just the traditional tests that are so typical in the engineering processes. So tests are in engineering ways of testing the technical artifacts. So you don't need to introduce a new label or a new concept. I think that there's a difference. And the difference, of course, it's not a matter of having a clear-cut demarcation test from the one side and experiments or explorative experiments from the other side. It's rather a continuum rather than a clear demarcation. But the difference is the generality. So these are experiments because the goal is to try to generalize from a single result to similar categories, similar cases, and to have like possibility of using this knowledge to make predictions on similar categories. Second point is, but are you sure that you still need this idea of control or experimental control? Because it's true that in many cases you don't have the traditional idea of control as manipulation, as considering like a very close environment like the lab and experimenting with these different limits of control. And I very much agree with this idea that it's not true that any kind of intervention is a form of experimentation. So I think that to maintain control is important to establish a difference between interventions in general and experiments in particular, even if I think that we need to revise a little bit the idea of traditional experimental controls of the natural sciences. And so this is the idea why I propose this a posteriori control. The third element is also, the third issue is an issue of, I would say, of method. And here is the point that I was mentioning at the beginning, like to try to cover the gap between what is written and what is done. So to try to cover the gap between the scripted level and a normative level and how to try to put them together. So it's true that so far I've been worked mainly on what is written, what has been published, but at the same time working in an artificial intelligence laboratory, I also worked in the field in a sense. But I think that here, this is a case in which the traditional methodological tools, for example, of philosophy of science should be enlarged with other tools coming from example from STS or sociology of science, like for example, interviews or direct observation are important. But anyway, being a philosopher, I'm interested not just at the level of description, but I think it's important to move up from the level of description and to try to have like a conceptual framework on these issues. So this is the summary, and sorry if I've taken more time. So my argument here is that explorative experiments are a new mode of experimentation in computer science and artificial intelligence, together with more traditional ones. And I think that this is an attempt to try to evaluate the peculiarities of the engineering disciplines. I don't even use the term science because I had to clarify what I mean by engineering sciences. There's a huge debate on this. But anyway, just engineering discipline is enough. And I think this is important because there is a lot of discussion also from a philosophical point of view. There's a new field that is the philosophy of engineering. So it's important to consider also how this discussion from a methodological point of view can be a contribute for the foundations of the philosophy of engineering. And basically, I think that it's not enough just to adapt the traditional ideas of experimentation coming from the natural sciences to the case of engineering disciplines. I think we need to conceive at least partially different ones in order to stretch the older ones. Okay, thank you very much.